Ask any of the big financial planners where to retire, and you get the same 3 answers on repeat. San Antonio, Austin, Houston. Say those names to someone who actually studies where retirees end up and watch them wince. San Antonio hands you a decade of afternoons stuck on loop 1604, watching brake lights instead of a sunset. Austin sells the dream with barbecue and live music, then quietly bills you for it with tech-driven density, rising municipal taxes, and subdivisions that keep swallowing the hill country. Houston gives you humidity thick enough to chew and daytime television that seems to exist only to sell you a reverse mortgage. None of that is a plan. It's just the path of least resistance dressed up as advice, repeated so often it starts to sound like research when it's really just habit. Nobody sits down and compares those 3 cities against anything else. They just get named over and over until repetition passes for due diligence. The retirees who actually get this right skip the shortcuts. They look at Florida the same way and they rule out the obvious names on purpose. No Orlando, no Tampa, no Miami suburbs. What's left is a set of towns most people have never heard mentioned in the same sentence as retirement, and every one of them earned its spot through home prices, healthcare access, and a lifestyle draw that actually holds up once you dig into it. None of these 10 were picked because they're charming on the surface. They were picked because the numbers held up once someone actually checked them against the state average, against the national average, against what a hospital 30 minutes away actually offers compared to 1-2 miles away. 10 towns, counting down to the one that rewards the people who did their homework instead of settling for a brochure. Here are 10 best Florida retirement towns nobody talks about. Apalachicola. 75 miles southwest of Tallahassee, on a stretch of Florida Panhandle coastline locals still call the Forgotten Coast, sits a town that never got the memo about high-rises. Apalachicola doesn't have any. No fast food chains crowding the waterfront either. What it has instead are 19th century brick warehouses, a working fishing fleet, and oysters that built the town's reputation long before anyone thought to market it as a retirement destination. The math backs up the atmosphere. A typical home here runs around $295,000, with median listings closer to $399,000 and sales settling around $349,000, a figure that's actually climbed close to 23% over the past year, even as the broader listing price has cooled. The overall cost of living sits roughly 3% below the national average, and stacked against Miami specifically, Apalachicola runs about 21% cheaper across the board. Housing costs alone come in 22% under the national figure, and transportation costs run almost 16% under, which adds up for anyone who plans to spend retirement driving to see grandchildren instead of flying. Healthcare costs run nearly 28% under the national average here, the steepest healthcare discount anywhere on this list. For daily medical needs, George E. Weems Memorial sits right in town, handling emergency care and physical therapy as a critical access facility. Anything more complex means a drive to Port St. Joe or Tallahassee. That's the trade-off with a town this small. But for retirees who want a real fishing village instead of a recreation of one, it's a trade most are happy to make. Coastal Florida without the coastal Florida price tag is rare enough on its own, but if avoiding the coast altogether sounds even better, the interior towns further up this list make an even stronger case. Gulfport. 5 miles from downtown St. Petersburg, tucked against Boca Ciega Bay, Gulfport runs on a different frequency than the rest of Pinellas County. Weekly art markets fill Beach Boulevard. The community theater stays busy. The town carries a welcoming LGBTQ-friendly reputation that sets it apart from the more corporate master plan developments filling up the rest of the county. And homes here move fast, closing in an average of just 20 days once they hit the market. An average home runs around $357,000, with sold prices trending closer to $452,000 and median listings running near $440,000, up close to 9% over the past year. That kind of speed and demand usually signals a market people are fighting to get into, and Gulfport is exactly that for buyers chasing authentic waterfront living at a discount to the broader St. Petersburg area. Here's where the research actually matters, because Gulfport isn't a town to walk into blind. Roughly 42% of properties here carry a major flood risk over the next 30 years. That's not a footnote. It's a number every buyer needs before they fall in love with a waterfront view, and it's exactly the kind of detail a rush decision would skip past. What softens that risk is what sits 2 miles away. HCA Florida Pasadena Hospital holds an A safety grade from the Leapfrog Group, and in January of this year it opened a new paramedic substation right on its campus, cutting emergency response times for the surrounding neighborhoods. A rehabilitation center sits a fifth of a mile from the hospital for anyone who needs longer-term recovery care after a hospital stay. Gulfport proves something worth remembering for the rest of this list. The honest answer about a place includes its downside. A retiree who knows about the flood risk and the emergency care nearby is making a real decision. One who doesn't isn't. Tarpon Springs. 30 miles northwest of Tampa, Tarpon Springs carries an identity you won't find replicated anywhere else on the Gulf Coast. Greek sponge divers settled this stretch of the Anclote River in the late 1800s, and the town still holds the highest percentage of Greek Americans of any city in the country. The sponge docks still function. The bakeries and restaurants aren't playing dress-up for tourists. They're just what's been here for generations, passed down the same way the diving trade itself was passed down. An average home runs around $391,000, a figure that's been correcting downward by about 4.5% over the past year, giving buyers room to negotiate in a town where over 91% of residents own rather than rent. That kind of home ownership rate says something about how long people tend to stay once they arrive. It's not a town people pass through on the way to somewhere else. Median listing prices have actually pulled back closer to 12% over the past year, even as sold prices climbed toward $452,000, a gap that tells you the asking price and the actual closing price aren't always telling the same story here. Retirees looking for something lower maintenance can find condos closer to $220,000, a real option for anyone who wants beach access without a yard to maintain. Rents run around $2,100 a month, reflecting steady demand for anything within walking distance of the water. Advent Health North Pinellas covers the town directly. Anything requiring a specialist means a 30 to 45-minute drive into Clearwater, St. Petersburg, or Tampa, but that's a short trip for the kind of advanced care those systems offer. Fred Howard Park and Sunset Beach round out the appeal, giving Tarpon Springs both a cultural identity and a coastline most retirees assume only exists further south, at a price that assumption usually costs extra for. Lake Placid. 95 miles south of Orlando, in the interior highlands of Highlands County, Lake Placid earned two nicknames that tell you everything about its character before you've seen a single photo. Locals call it the town of murals, and it's not an exaggeration. Close to 50 large-scale paintings cover buildings throughout downtown, turning an ordinary walk through the center of town into something closer to an open-air gallery. They also call it the Caladium capital of the world, a nod to the flower fields that ring the area and bloom into color every growing season. 27 freshwater lakes surround the town, including Lake June in winter and Lake Clay, giving residents boating and bass fishing without a single coastal insurance premium attached. A typical home here runs about $239,000, with median listings near $325,000, down about 3% over the past year, and sales settling closer to $280,000. That puts the town roughly 12% below Florida's overall baseline, one of the more affordable entries on this list, measured against a local median household income of around $54,800. Home ownership here runs above 80%, another sign of a community people settle into rather than pass through. Advent Health Lake Placid sits directly in town, and it's not just a small clinic filling space. The Leapfrog Group has named it a top teaching hospital, offering cardiology, senior care, and orthopedics without requiring a drive to a bigger city first. Interior towns get written off as sleepy sometimes. Lake Placid answers that with murals on every corner and a hospital rating most coastal towns would envy. It's also a preview of a pattern that keeps repeating for the rest of this list. The towns sitting furthest inland, away from the coastline, keep landing at the cheaper end of the price scale, and it isn't random. Coastal insurance across Florida has climbed for years on the back of storm exposure, and a town built on higher, drier ground simply doesn't carry that overhead. Add in that Florida charges no state income tax, and that its Save Our Homes provision caps how much a home's assessed value can climb each year for tax purposes once residency is established, and a retiree on a fixed income gets something rare, a number they can actually plan around 5 or 10 years out instead of guessing. Dunnellon? 21 miles southwest of Ocala, close enough to reach the horse country's amenities without living inside its traffic, Dunnellon sits along the Rainbow River. The water here runs spring-fed and clear, staying near 72 degrees year-round, which means kayaking and paddleboarding without any of the saltwater wear that eats away at coastal properties over time. It's also about 12 miles inland from the Gulf at Crystal River, close enough to feel the coast without absorbing its costs. A median home lists around $293,000, coming in close to 10% cheaper than the Florida average, and up modestly from around $287,000 the year before. The local market currently scores 68 out of 100 on momentum, which favors buyers, and close to a quarter of active listings have already seen price corrections to attract them. Average rent runs around $1,800, noticeably under the national figure. Run the math on income against home value, and you land around 4.5 years of gross income to own outright. A number of financial planners actually watch closely when assessing long-term affordability for retirees on fixed pensions. Healthcare here works in layers. Local clinics like VIP Care Dunnellon and the Dunnellon Multi-Specialty Medical Center cover routine care in town. Tampa General's Crystal River location sits 12 miles out for more involved needs, and HCA Florida Ocala anchors the region with the only Level 1 trauma center serving 3 surrounding counties. That's not a small detail for anyone thinking seriously about what happens in an emergency, especially somewhere that markets itself on quiet rather than proximity to a major hospital corridor. Dunnellon is another clear example of that same inland pattern. Move away from the coast, and home values along with insurance costs tend to drop together, a trend that shows up again in the next 2 towns on this list. Inverness. 30 miles west of Ocala, surrounded by state forests and conservation land, Inverness might be the single best value on this entire list. Housing costs run close to 22% below the national average. Groceries land nearly 20% under. Healthcare costs sit right around that same 22% discount. 3 major categories of retirement spending, all discounted at once, is not something that happens by accident in most markets. An average home here runs about $241,000, with certain zip codes landing within a few $100s of that same figure, showing the affordability holds steady across the wider area rather than concentrating in one lucky pocket. Median listings run closer to $285,000, up modestly over the past year, even as the average home value corrected slightly downward. The typical price lands around 4 times the local median income, a ratio noticeably lighter than most of the state. HCA Florida Citrus Hospital sits right in the city and has picked up national recognition for both outpatient prostate care and orthopedic surgery, which means residents aren't settling for a lesser standard of medicine just because the town is small. The Tsala Apopka chain of lakes wraps around Inverness, and the Withlacoochee State Trail, 46 miles of paved path, runs straight through downtown. Retirees who want to walk or bike somewhere scenic every day without getting in a car first have that built into daily life here. Affordable and well cared for rarely show up in the same sentence about the same town. Inverness is the exception, and it sets a bar the rest of this list has to work to match. Mount Dora. 30 miles northwest of Orlando, Mount Dora sits on a ridge, which sounds minor until you realize how much of Florida is flat by comparison. At just over 137 feet above sea level, the elevation gives the town rolling streets and oak canopies that feel more like New England than the rest of the peninsula, right down to the brick storefronts downtown. An average home runs close to $395,000, and the estimated monthly cost of ownership, once taxes and insurance are factored in, lands around $2,800. Homes here sell in a median of about 69 days, a pace that suggests neither desperation nor a feeding frenzy, just a steady, balanced market. That's a premium compared to some interior towns on this list, but Mount Dora isn't competing on rock bottom price. It's competing on atmosphere, with a historic downtown full of antique shops and a wine scene that draws people in from well outside the county, in a town whose average resident age sits closer to 46, younger than the retiree-heavy image the name might suggest. Retirees looking for a structured, age-restricted setting can find that inside the town limits too, with communities like the lakes of Mount Dora sitting at a premium closer to $511,000 for that added layer of amenities. Advent Health Waterman covers the area from nearby Tavares, under 15 minutes away, and Orlando's larger hospital systems are reachable in about 35 minutes thanks to the completed Wakiva Parkway extension. Lake Dora hosts sailing regattas throughout the year, giving the town a lakefront identity that most people associate associate with places much further north. Mount Dora proves you don't have to leave Florida to get that feeling. DeLand. 23 miles from the Atlantic at Daytona Beach and 35 miles north of Orlando, DeLand sits in a spot most retirees overlook simply because it isn't directly on the coast. What it has instead is Stetson University, Florida's oldest private college, and the cultural energy that comes with a campus embedded into a walkable, historic downtown. Utility costs here run about 17% below the national average, and overall housing costs sit comfortably below Florida's statewide median of $377,578. The market currently favors buyers, with homes selling close to 2% below asking price over a median of roughly 63 days on the market. An average home lands around $336,000, with median listings near $390,000, up close to 3.5% over the past year, even as the median sold price held flat closer to $365,000. Active adult buyers have options too, with communities like Victoria Gardens keeping listings closer to $360,000, folded into the same historic town feel as the rest of DeLand rather than sitting off on its own. Advent Health DeLand operates a full acute care hospital directly in the city, covering emergency services, cardiovascular care, and orthopedic surgery without requiring a drive elsewhere. For anything more specialized, the Daytona Beach Systems or North Orlando's larger networks are accessible along Interstate 4. What makes DeLand different from a typical college town is scale. Stetson's red brick campus fits into the community instead of dominating it, which means bookstores, breweries, and local theater without the density that usually comes with a university this well regarded. Sebastian. 14 miles north of Vero Beach, sitting directly on the Indian River Lagoon, Sebastian tells one of the more interesting stories on this entire list, and it's a healthcare story before it's anything else. In October of 2024, Orlando Health acquired the Sebastian River Medical Center, a 103-bed hospital, for $439 million, as part of a broader investment exceeding $750 million across the Space and Treasure Coast region. That's not a small clinic getting a facelift. That's a major nonprofit health system deciding a town most people have never heard of deserved serious capital, the kind most retirees assume only flows toward the big-name cities. The result is a town where residents no longer need to drive to Melbourne or Vero Beach for quality care, because that care arrived on their doorstep. Home values here run around $350,000 on average, with homes selling in a median of about 71 days. And for retirees looking at entry-level options, the Barefoot Bay neighborhood offers manufactured housing starting near $189,000. The town's affordability index sits around 106, a solid mark for financial stability, even though average rent runs a bit higher than the state figure at around $2,000 a month. The Pelican Island National Wildlife Refuge sits within town limits, the first federal bird sanctuary ever established in the country, and Sebastian Inlet State Park gives residents saltwater fishing and surfing without the density of a bigger beach town nearby. Small towns get written off as medically underserved all the time. Sebastian is the proof that assumption doesn't always hold. High Springs. 16 to 20 miles northwest of Gainesville sits the town that makes this entire list worth the research it took to build. High Springs isn't a secret waiting to be found. It's what you get when you actually finish the homework instead of stopping at the first three names everyone else already knows. An average home here runs around $334,000, with median listings near $360,000, down close to 3% over the past year, and sales settling around $312,000, giving buyers real room to negotiate in a market that's cooled slightly. The estimated monthly cost of ownership, taxes, and insurance included comes to about $2,362. Healthcare costs sit close to 22% below the national average, matching some of the best figures anywhere on this list, and home ownership here runs around 80%, a strong showing for a town this size. What sets High Springs apart isn't just affordability, it's the two hospital systems within reach. HCA Florida North Florida Hospital, a 523-bed facility, has been named one of Health Health grades as 250 best hospitals in the country. 20 miles away, UF Health Shands ranks nationally in geriatrics, neurology, pulmonology, and urology. For everyday needs, Palms Medical Group and Simd Health cover primary care and physical therapy without requiring the drive into Gainesville at all. No other town on this list pairs affordability with two nationally ranked systems at the same time. High Springs also serves as the gateway to some of Florida's clearest natural springs. Ginny Springs, Poe Springs, and Blue Springs all sit within reach, offering swimming, snorkeling, and cave diving in water clear enough to see straight to the bottom. The historic downtown adds art galleries and antique shops, giving the town a walkable identity to go with the natural scenery surrounding it. Every other town on this list solved one or two problems well. High Springs solves affordability, medical access, and lifestyle at the same time, which is exactly why it sits at the top. Look back across these 10 towns and a pattern shows up that no single one of them reveals on its own. The towns furthest from the coast, Dunnellon, Inverness, Lake Placid, High Springs, consistently posted the lowest home values and the least exposure to the insurance costs, now climbing along Florida's shoreline. Meanwhile, the townspeople assume are too small for real medical care. Sebastian and High Springs among them turned out to have some of the strongest hospital access on the entire list, in one case backed by hundreds of millions of dollars in fresh investment. Neither pattern was hiding. Both were sitting in the same public data everyone else had access to. The difference was whether someone bothered to check the interior towns against the coastal ones, or the small hospitals against the acquisitions quietly reshaping them instead of stopping at whatever name came up first. That's really what separates this list from the version most people settle for. It isn't luck, and it isn't insider access to some hidden database. It's a willingness to compare towns most people have never bothered to look up against metrics most people never think to check before signing anything. The retirees who end up in Dunnellon or High Springs instead of a crowded Orlando suburb didn't stumble into a better outcome. They built one comparison at a time, using numbers that were sitting there in plain view the whole time. That same approach carries past this list too. The three obvious cities named at the start of this video aren't unique in getting picked by default. Every state has its version of Orlando, Tampa, and Miami suburbs. The names that come up first because they come up first, not because anyone actually checked them against the alternative down the road. The towns on this list didn't get overlooked because they lacked anything. They got overlooked because most people stop looking the moment a familiar name shows up. The next retiree who does this same exercise somewhere else will find their own version of Dunnellon or High Springs, a town nobody put on a list because nobody bothered to run the numbers on it first. The method matters more than any single name on this countdown. Check the distance to the nearest real hospital instead of trusting a brochure. Check what a home actually costs against local income instead of the marketing price. That's the difference between ending up somewhere by accident and choosing it on purpose. Notice too how differently the risk shows up once someone actually looks. Gulfport's flood exposure didn't disqualify it. It just meant a buyer walked in knowing the number instead of finding out the hard way after closing. Sebastian's hospital wasn't marketed as a selling point before the acquisition made headlines. It became one because someone tracked the story instead of assuming a small town meant small medicine. That's the pattern underneath every entry on this list. Not blind optimism about a place, and not reflexive suspicion either. Just a plain look at what the data actually says before deciding anything. None of that shows up on a highlight reel. It shows up when someone actually reads the numbers instead of repeating the same three city names everyone else defaults to. No Orlando, no Tampa, no Miami suburbs, just the towns that were there the whole time, waiting for someone willing to look.